Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations. Hi, everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe, and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to give us a follow and turn on notifications so that you don't miss any conversations. Now, in today's episode, we are talking about how to have difficult, tough, or uncomfortable conversations. Our guest today is Chris Feinas. Chris has some excellent firsthand experience with these types of conversations as a business owner with employees and clients, as a husband and father, and as he has been a coach to the group leaders at the Ridge. So he spends time training leaders on how to have these types of conversations. So in this episode, Chris shares when do you talk about these things, his own experience with them, common mistakes to avoid, and a lot more. This is my conversation with Chris. Hi, Chris. Thanks for coming on to the podcast.
Hey, John. My pleasure.
So you are currently in Wisconsin, and so I have to ask, but you're usually in Florida. When you're in Florida and you know you're coming back to Wisconsin, is there a food item that you're craving? You're like, oh, I cannot wait because they just don't have this delicious form of that in Florida.
Oh, absolutely. A couple of things. Pizza.
Ooh.
I don't know why they don't know how to make pizza right there. If anybody from Florida is listening, I'm very sorry, but you do it wrong. Midwest pizza, there's something about it.
Yeah.
And cheese. Hey, Wisconsin is cheese. Cheese is Wisconsin, and Wisconsin is cheese. So,
no doubt. So I'm going to follow up on that. What is the quote right pizza?
It's got to be that thin, crispy crust.
Ooh.
What we tend to run into in Florida a lot is really the influence from New York, I think, and just kind of that doughy, floppy. And, there's some people that love that, but, me growing up as a Midwesterner, it's like, sorry, but I just tell people that's wrong.
I love that. And I'm sure that, I'm going to try to segue this. You ready for this? I'm sure that telling somebody in Florida that their pizza is wrong is a difficult conversation.
Absolutely. It's sure. Sometimes it is. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, you, obviously right now at the Ridge, you're the group's coach, right? And so I'm sure part of that involves training leaders to have all sorts of different types of conversations, and that's some of those conversations just by the virtue of, I think, life and, how it looks like to be in community with people is sometimes those are more challenging conversations. But obviously your experience isn't just that too. You're also a business owner. And so you're dealing with clients and employees and all sorts of different things and just life in general, right?
Right.
Come up with lots of different moments where you've had to have challenging, difficult conversations. When somebody asks you for advice, hey, how do you have uncomfortable, challenging, tough conversations, what advice do you give them?
I would say probably one of the most important pieces of advice with that is it probably relates to typically what people try to do most with a difficult conversation is put it off, either put it off or avoid it. And I think that's a mistake. If something happens, look, let's define a difficult conversation. It's a conversation that you have to have with someone because something isn't going right. And if you're the one choosing to have it with someone else, it usually means that, a lot of the responsibility lies on the other person. So, that's uncomfortable. I don't think that there's really anybody, and if so, it's an extremely small percentage that actually enjoys having a conversation like that.
Yeah.
And I can say from experience of doing it wrong a lot, and trying to really avoid those things, because sometimes you have to have those conversations with people that you genuinely like a lot.
Yeah.
But you have to have a conversation and talk about something that they're not really necessarily going to like. I think that one of the best things to do is just to have that conversation quickly. and there's obviously a lot of other moving parts to that as well. But really the biggest thing is to just have that conversation right away. The longer you wait, I think the longer people try to play the preview of that conversation in their mind.
Yeah.
And chances are it usually doesn't go the way that they're thinking.
Yeah, I think we can put aside that that group of people or that just general thought process. Because obviously there are situations in which, maybe it's a difficult conversation because it actually is one that you aren't the right person to be having, and that's probably maybe a separate conversation. But let's assume for the sake of our conversation, this is a person that, it is probably your job to have this conversation with that person. How do you go about, I guess, being like walking that line of realizing, okay, no, I actually need to be the one to engage this person with this thing. Whether that's a boundary you need to set with them, or whether that's, just like kind of airing out maybe something challenging that's happening, or how do you kind of decide if you're the right person to talk to them?
Well, that's a good question. And every situation can obviously look a little bit different, but, I would say it simply comes down to this, like, what are the facts of the issue? Do they directly relate to you? Do you really know the story? Do you know the whole story? And I think if obviously if it's in like a business situation, it should be pretty simple. Are you the person that they report to? Yeah, it's definitely your responsibility to have that conversation. In a family situation, are you the parent and it's the child? Obviously that's easy, but it's not always quite that easy. Sometimes, especially when you get into family situations and situations with like groups of friends, groups of acquaintances, where maybe somebody's feelings were hurt for some reason. Someone did something to hurt that other person, or somehow cause them to be upset. I think the people that are the most directly involved are the ones that should have the conversation. I think it's really difficult when you start drawing other people in that maybe weren't quite as directly involved. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I think expanding on that, I think a pretty good barometer can be, am I the person with like you said, the most direct relationship to this person on that issue? Or like, if you feel like you need to speak into this topic, the solution might be equipping the person that is, right? So how that might look in a family scenario is, say there's a challenging situation that occurs with like an in-law, right? And it's like, maybe you're not the person to have that conversation with your in-law, but you equip your spouse, or you equip, your sibling or something like that, where you equip them to have that conversation versus taking it on yourself.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. And, just to expand on that a little bit, whether it's you equipping, or if you're already that person, just relying on keeping that conversation about facts and not so much about opinions. And I think when there's more than just two people involved with the conversation, I think that tends to happen more often than not. And that's when things really sometimes start to spin out of control, is when opinions come into it more than just, hey, this is what happened, this is how it affected me, or this is how I feel about it, And then sometimes it's, here's what I'd like you to do about it, or sometimes it's just, this is what I'd like you to know about what happened. And I guess those both look a little bit different, but I think equally they both need to be said.
Yeah. And I think it's really good also that you mention like the feel aspect of that. Like, I think that sometimes people feel like it's unfair to communicate how something made them feel. But the reality is that typically your goal at the end of one of these conversations is like a greater relationship with the person, Or, I mean, obviously, if it's like in a business sense, maybe that's the case. But maybe you just need them to like pay their bill or something. In which case, that might not be as much concerned about the particular relationship. But for the most part, I think the goal is to be like, the reason you have these hard conversations is because on the other side of them, like there's a greater form of that relationship out there, you know? And so I think it's very fair to communicate how a situation made you feel or made someone feel, and advocate for that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? The thing is that the two people don't always have to necessarily agree.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's just airing out how that made you feel, and just asking that person to, hey, be a little more careful next time when we're in this kind of situation. Maybe don't say something like that. Maybe it's not so much what you said, it's the way you said it. And I think it's really healthy to talk about that in that way. And again, it's not so much of a hey, I want you to fix you. Stop acting like that. I think that's where things get a little bit difficult with those kind of conversations. Is where the person it feels like you're trying to fix them in a way. And that's why I was saying, and just to clarify a little bit, that's why I said, make sure that it's about facts. Feelings are facts, right?
Yeah.
Like how you feel. But sometimes, things get a little bit too wrapped up in like, well, I think you were trying to do this, and it's not so much a problem to communicate that, but sometimes that gets a little bit difficult, a little more difficult than it should.
Yeah, definitely. So like on that vein, like you mentioned, say you are the person that's right to have the conversation, right? You mentioned being able to do it quickly, obviously maybe not be in a state of heightened emotion or something like that, but relatively quickly. Is there any other, like maybe some mistakes that you would say, hey, try to avoid this?
Yeah. One of them that stands out, and I think is really common in our culture right now, is trying to have that conversation by text or email. Like, conversations can be taken in so many different ways. I mean, tone, what you really meant. There are all kinds of different ways when you type, whether that be an email or a text. If you're having a conversation that's a little bit sensitive and where you really have to communicate with someone that something that you think was wrong or needs to be changed or needs to be corrected, I think it's really important. Probably ideally face-to-face is best, but at least voice-to-voice. And just really avoid, because things can be taken so wrong by text.
Yeah. I think that's really good. Especially because like, I think that everybody gravitates towards maybe what's most comfortable for them. Like that is just what's natural, right? There's nothing wrong with like that. But I think that you're so right in that comfortability, I think you lose the most effective way to communicate. Now, what you're not saying, right, is like, I think some people, maybe you write something out because it helps you think through how to say something. That's totally fine. Maybe not sending that.
Right. Yeah. How many times I think so many people can use that example of they type something out and they hit send and, I wish I could take that back, but you can't. And I think that whole dynamic of having a personal conversation, because what that really is it tends to make it more relational.
Yeah.
And I think that's important, because one of the things about having a difficult situation or difficult conversation is I think maybe people are having to realize that, you know what, I'm not always right. And maybe you are, maybe the facts are clear and they're cut and dry and this was right. And what they did was wrong, but, nobody's perfect. And, one of the things that, I had a conversation kind of similarly, recently. It was kind of like saying, hey, and it was someone that was thinking of having a difficult conversation with someone else.
Yeah.
And what it really came down to is, hey, do you ever remember a time where maybe you kind of made a similar mistake? And the person had to admit, like, yeah, I did. And I think that comes down to that, where a conversation like that, it's important to share truth, but it's also important to have a little bit of grace, knowing that, hey, we all make mistakes. And I think that's where that relational part of that conversation is so important, because you can have a conversation, you can tell someone very clearly that, let's say it was something that really hurt you in some way, but there's a way that you can have that conversation and still show grace and still share the truth of what really happened. And I think that's the best way to have that conversation.
Is there any like tips that you would say about how you can approach something like with grace? Is there any like, I don't know, phrases that you found helpful, or like, not to get mechanical with it, but I mean, maybe it's as simple as, I start off by saying, hey, tell me what you were thinking, or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, just things kind of like, hey, I understand, I've been there. I know how you feel. And I've been in the same situation as you, however, here's how this made me feel, or here's how this affected our business, or here's how that customer reacted. And really, it's just that's just a bad mark on us now. Or, I don't know that our relationship is going to be the same, but I really understand. I would hope that, you would want things to get better, and just kind of talking to someone like that, as far as grace. Yeah. I think you hear a lot of people talk about like, oh, I'm a truth person, or I'm a grace person, so I'm going to always lead with grace, or I'm going to always lead with truth. And I think that's a little bit dangerous sometimes going into relational conversations, because we would tend to, if you give too much grace, people walk all over you. And if you just hammer someone with nothing but the truth, sometimes that's going to just push people away from you and create a very lonely situation. I think, the person that we look to for the example of grace and truth is Jesus, right? And he was perfect. We're never going to be exactly like him, but I think if we are going to try to use the example of how Jesus related to people, and let's face it, he had a lot of very difficult conversations.
Oh yeah.
And I really think using his example is the best we can find, without a doubt.
Yeah. So how much of that, like, maybe it's the grace element or the understanding their perspective, or trying to at least, how much of that is like preparation beforehand? Like how is it important to how important is it to think through what you want to say and how you're going to go about the conversation?
Yeah. I think it's important to maybe try to put yourself in that person's shoes, and whatever happened in that situation, and some situations are easier than others to do that. But I'd say maybe try to put yourself in that person's shoes and maybe understand why they would have done what they did, said what they said, or put you in whatever situation that was. But again, it comes back to like, what are the facts? Not just your opinion about what happened, but what are the facts of what happened? And just talk to them about what happened and what the effect was. And I think that's the best way to approach it.
I'm curious, you mentioned the idea of kind of like a spiraling conversation. Now, sometimes a conversation spirals and it just spirals and there's nothing you can do about it and you've kind of lost it, is there any, no, I'm sure no one's experienced that before. Is there anything you can do in that moment when you start to notice a conversation going sideways where you can kind of at least attempt to get it back on track?
Yeah, and I guess it's all situation by situation. But probably the best advice, and I got this advice from someone else a long time ago, and I've chosen to use it many times, and there's some times I failed miserably, is just make sure you're the one that's keeping calm. Keep a calm tone, keep a low tone. Obviously you don't want, I would hope that people don't want to have a huge fight or a huge argument or to have things escalate. And if you don't want that to happen, I think you need to be the one to lead by example on that. And just by really remaining calm, being respectful, I think, things can go sideways, names can be called and accusations can fly and things like that as people get heated. But just kind of keeping all of that under control and keeping the perspective on what's the goal. Hopefully you went into that conversation saying, I want a resolution. At the end of this conversation, I want things to be better. Hopefully maybe that the relationship between the two people are better, but at least that whatever problem is going on is going to be resolved and fixed moving forward. And I think just staying calm is the key to that.
I think that's so wise, because I know that I've experienced, right, where you start to lose your calm, and then maybe you say something that's not even that it's like hurtful or wrong or something, but it just detracts from the conversation. And then all of a sudden this conversation was about this issue now becomes about this other issue, maybe even how you said something, and you're right. You lose your goal outcome when, you start to say and be a part of the detracting conversation, right? Because you lose focus. And obviously, okay, well, nobody's a robot and comes in and is like, there's no emotion in it, but there is a piece of like, if you can stay composed, that is so helpful. Something I know that's been helpful for me is there are moments where it's like, you just need to take a deep breath or say a little prayer, and like in that moment, like, God, help me have this conversation. Help me stay calm. Help me remember the purpose, and kind of use that as a tool too, I think.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes you just need to walk away. That's not ideal. That's probably one of the last resorts, because if you start the conversation, you want to see it through. But if things really start getting escalated, maybe you just, hey, you know what? I think we need to just pause this right now, but we definitely need to come back to this and talk about it some more at a time when we're both a little bit more calm.
We mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, kind of just like the different, you've had a lot of experience with this, you've lots of different areas of experience with this. How have some of the tough conversations that you've had kind of shaped your understanding of this?
Yeah, I think one of the realities that I've learned is, you can never really be sure how the conversation's going to go. As an employer, I've had to fire people. I've had to have conversations about how, if something doesn't change, that the next step would be that they wouldn't have a job anymore. Had to have conversations with teenagers that didn't like, parental rules in the house. I think a lot of people can relate to that. Either because you either have a teenager or you've been a teenager. So you kind of know how those different things go. But, I think the one truth is you never really know how it's going to go. And just kind of going back to something I said earlier is like, trying to have that conversation in your mind over and over again. You don't know how that's going to go. So, part of my advice would be, don't get all worked up and assume that it's going to go bad. But be prepared. I think if you go into it with a positive attitude and really approaching things in a really respectful, factual manner where you just communicate very clearly. And I think that's the other thing. Be clear. Don't beat around the bush. I think that is really the best way to handle that.
Any tips for being clear?
Don't talk too much. Really, I think
talking to the wrong guy for that one.
Well, hey, you run a podcast, so
fair enough.
What can you do?
Yeah.
But I think it's really easy to try to put way too many words to either communicating a fact or answering a question. I think for the sake of clarity, I think less is more. Being clear, saying everything that needs to be said, and just hoping that you get at least a relatively positive response.
Yeah, I think that's probably part of knowing who you're talking to as well. Right. And sometimes you're going to have a better opportunity to have that than others. But particularly like in a marriage relationship, right. You have Like you probably know the person really well and you probably know how they might hear something. It's not necessarily in your favorite way to communicate it, but it's most effective if you're communicating it how they hear it. Right. And I mean, that's probably true, right? How you're talking to a teenager on an issue is going to be different than how you're talking to an employee or a spouse. You know what I mean? Like what's clear to one person might not be the same way it's clear to another.
Right. Yeah. Well, and especially when you say, it's funny what you say about spouse, because that's the person you know the best. And yet I still get it wrong pretty often. So
I'm sure nobody else can relate to that, Chris.
Right. But yet I am given grace very often as well. So, so I'm pretty lucky that way.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of this, right? Is, think through, I know that I've been the recipient of tough conversations too. Right. Yeah. And so I think that, that can be a super helpful factor, right? Is, hey, what do you wish you would have heard? How do you wish somebody would have talked to you through an issue? And, I know probably is there any other things on that from just like your experiences?
No, I think that's it.
So I know probably one of the biggest factors in this is that I think a lot of times people just like kind of lack the confidence to have this. I'm sure particularly, in your role where you're talking to group leaders, maybe many of them haven't had any training or any type of things on this, and you're trying to build their confidence to have these types of conversations. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah. And it's pretty simple. I think keeping it, not that it is simple. I think keeping it simple is really important. And sometimes people feel really overwhelmed and over their head about a certain topic that's going on because maybe it's just really volatile, really kind of an explosive type situation. And they're just sitting there, especially if it's someone that's volunteering out of the kindness of their heart to do something like what a group leader does. Yeah. They're not an employee. This isn't something that they're doing for their job. They're doing this because they want to and because they want to serve. So it tends to be a little bit more difficult that way because they also tend to not really want to, be in a situation where they're in a volatile conversation and they don't want to really rock the boat. And they want to also do what's best for everyone because there's usually a group involved and hopefully a tough conversation isn't happening in front of a group because that's one thing. I mean, keep that private, but really, I think it just goes back to the basics that we were talking about. Know your facts, be factual, be calm, have grace, go into it with grace, communicate grace to them. But also tell them the truth of what's going on. If something is going on, like if it's a group leader and one of the group members, there's something going on that's causing some trouble. It's good for the person you're talking to communicate that clearly, because otherwise, if you don't have that conversation, eventually something will erupt that you really don't have any control over at all.
Yeah. I think that is such a powerful thing to think through, is essentially the concept of this is actually a loving thing for that person. And what I'm choosing is to do a loving thing for them. It's like, it may be hard and there may be some pain involved, right? But pulling out a splinter is painful, but it's the most loving thing you can do, Right. And so you can have, if your motivation is that, right? Because I think that's something that, our lead pastor Mark has shared before, is that what's your motivation in having that conversation can be so key, because if it is what's trying to help them and your relationship, great. If it's really fully focused on yourself and not necessarily the other person at all, I feel like that's when you get into situations where people sense that too. Now, obviously there's some nuance to that, right? Like you talk about having to fire an employee and, maybe that doesn't feel like what's best for them. But if they're in a situation where they're not succeeding, you know?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And hopefully that's the heart behind it is not only is this not working for the company, but this just isn't mutually beneficial,
Yeah.
and certainly in the case of employer employee, but I mean, sometimes you can even have that conversation, relating to friendships as well.
Yeah.
Like, hey, maybe we need to have a little bit of distance,
Yeah.
and here's why, and it's not because, I don't like you or I want to hurt you or anything like that. But, hopefully the intention is for mutual benefit.
Yeah. Now, obviously, have to give the caveat if there's anything unsafe or harmful or something like that going on. Like, obviously, one, like if you're in a dangerous situation, don't have those conversations anyway.
Just get away.
Right. But it's okay to have conversations that are related to your safety or well-being too. Like that's
right.
That's not what we're addressing here. But
right.
Got to give that clarifier there.
Right. Absolutely.
Any final thoughts, Chris? Any final thoughts?
One of the things, as we were talking, one of the things that it started going through reels in my mind of conversations that I've had to have over the years. And the things that pop up are the ones I did wrong. One of the things that I remember that I really had to break the habit of, and it's really made a difference, and I'm very conscious of it now if I have to have a difficult conversation, is don't start it with a bunch of small talk. If you're having a conversation if you have to have a conversation with someone about something specific that's going to be of maybe a difficult nature or a sensitive nature, just get right to it. I think when you start beating around the bush and having a bunch of small talk, and then all of a sudden, hey, we got to talk about this problem that we're having. I think it's just good to talk about, hey, I have to talk to you about something really important. And this is something that I really feel we need to talk about now.
Yeah.
And I think just being direct and getting right to it, I think is really important.
Yeah. That's really good advice. Chris, thank you so much. I know that it's not always the most fun to talk about hard things. And I think that's just part of life is that if we want to grow and we want to truly be loving and help others grow as well and kind of move together and experience, we talk about the hope of Jesus, experience the hope of Jesus. That's part of that and part of community and relationships. And just really grateful that you sharing some wisdom and some techniques on how we can have those conversations. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Not a problem, John. Anytime.
Well, that was my conversation with Chris, and I love his practical advice to stick to the facts and to have the conversation as soon as you can. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast, and make sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.